Good morning, Anna. So, those of you online today, we're going to be heavily relying on you guys for answers to questions that I might ask because there's more of you than there are people in person today. And I'm saying that because yesterday in my second hour, there were 2 people in the room and everyone else was online. And those online turds made all those 2 poor boys answer all the questions. So, we're going to put the pressure on you guys online today instead of the people in class and give them a little bit of a break and ask you guys all the questions today. So be ready for that one. Meaning you have to actually pay attention today because you never know when I'm going to call on you because I'll probably pick individual people. And today's topic, we are going to be going over Christian art, Romanesque architecture, and Gothic architecture, as well as discussing what was happening in Northern Europe during that time period with the arts. We're going to see some shifting changes. Yesterday, when we ended, the Roman Empire was expanding and conquering more and more land. And today we are going to be going over the fall of the Roman Empire. Yesterday we built it up and today we're going to break it down. So we are starting with early Christian and Byzantine artworks today. Originally, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire, but in year 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan. He did that because he was really, really sick and he thought he was dying, so he adopted Christianity, and then all of a sudden, miraculously, he got better. So he legalized Christianity and he forced the entire army to convert to Christianity. So that's kind of a bit of a humorous story to think that just a few years prior they were crucifying Christians, and now all of a sudden, because Constantine didn't die, they are all going to be Christian. Unfortunately, when Christianity was illegal, meaning not allowed, they had to worship underground in catacombs, which were burial chambers. That was to hide themselves from the authorities so that they wouldn't be caught, because it was illegal and they would have been thrown in jail and fined and possibly probably killed. Of course, all of that catacomb worshiping ends when Constantine legalizes Christianity. And after that, actual above ground churches are built for Christians. So here is an image of Christ and the apostles that was found in one of those early catacomb worshiping areas. They did decorate those catacombs with little murals such as this one. Of course, it's quite a bit different from the Greek and Roman art that we've been looking at. Can anyone grasp as to why it is different from Greek and Roman art? Someone online, why is this different? Or how is this different? Just take a guess. You're probably going to be fine. Just by looking at it.
It's in a cave.
It is underground. It's not so much a cave as it's just like an underground chamber. Most Greek and Roman art was not underground. But I'm thinking more of like what it looks like in comparison to, let's say, the paintings from Pompeii that we found. Is there a difference in the art style here?
They're clothed.
They are clothed. That is definitely a feature that will come up throughout Christian art. They do clothe their figures, while the Greeks and Romans did not. Well, the Romans usually clothed theirs. Sometimes they didn't. The main difference, though, is the fact that this is a lot more two-dimensional. They aren't trying to make it look realistic. They aren't trying to make these people look like actual people. They're very flat. And that is another thing that is very common with Christian art. They portray human figures as very flat and a bit cartoonish. Also, throughout Christian art, we don't see too many statues. We're going to look at one final statue, which is the head of Constantine. Constantine made a colossus of himself. Any guess as to what a colossus might be? Just by hearing that word. Is for anyone in class or online. Colossus. A really, really big statue. Very good. Yeah, so a colossus is a really, really large statue. And he had that made of himself. We only have bits and pieces left today, but we are going to look at the head that we still have. You'll notice it has really, really large cartoonish eyes and some interesting features. Those large eyes are supposed to suggest like looking towards heaven or having heaven's light and spiritual awakening, which is another common theme that you'll notice with Christian art. Constantine will eventually move the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople. Well, it used to be Byzantium, when he renamed it Constantinople. That's present-day Istanbul. We talked about that before when we were going over Hagia Sophia. The Roman Empire ended up dividing into two halves shortly after that move. There developed an Eastern Empire and a Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire ended up adopting a form of Christianity known as Roman Catholicism. The Eastern Roman Empire adopted a form of Christianity called Eastern Orthodox Christianity. They are slightly different, and we'll be talking about those differences later on when we talk about Eastern Orthodox. Because the first period of art that we're going to look at, or the first geographic location, is the Roman Catholic side. So it's not going to be too odd for us. There's going to be a lot of biblical imagery. The Eastern Orthodox side is going to be a little different, though, because they have different rules. Eventually, the Roman Empire will collapse, particularly the western half will end up collapsing in year 476 when it falls to the barbarian or Germanic tribes of the north. The Romans and the Greeks, literally, if you weren't Roman or Greek, they called you barbarians. That has to do with the fact that when they heard these people of these Germanic tribes speak, all they understood was bar, 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 bar. So they nicknamed them the barbarians. The barbarians have no written language, and the Greeks and Romans consider them very much inferior. But eventually those barbarians will conquer Rome. The eastern half is going to be conquered by the Mongols. Here is that Colossus head of Constantine with the very large eyes that are looking up towards heaven. Once again, this would have been a full body statue, but unfortunately we only have bits and pieces. We have the head, one of his hands that's pointing like this, a kneecap, and a foot. Like I mentioned, when Christianity is legalized, they start building churches for Christian worship that are not underground. Those churches are called basilicas when they first pop up. Basilicas were originally where the seats of government were located in these Roman cities, but they ended up converting them to churches. So how the basilica is set up, I'll actually just go to this section here. You have your central gate, which you would walk through, your atrium, which is like a garden open air area. It's right here. There's usually a little bit of a well right there. Then you walk into the church and there is a nave and 2 aisles. The aisles exist so that pilgrims or tourists could go around and look at the relics without disturbing mass. So inside of this, there would be aisles on the side for tourism so that there'd be relics located around that transept. Relics were important objects that were supposedly owned or belonged, or pieces of famous biblical characters such as the veil of Mary, or a splinter from the cross, and those would be housed in little sections behind that transept, and it brought in tourism for those churches, as well as money. And with tourism comes money. So that is an early basilica shape. It is obviously just a plain rectangle. Some churches did differ from that rectangular shape. One such church is the Church of San Vitale, located in Ravenna. Instead of being a rectangular shape, it is an octagonal shape. The Church of San Vitale, however, unlike a normal basilica, is a private family church, which is most likely the reason why it is different in shape. It doesn't need to be as large as a basilica and house as many people. It just needs to be big enough to hold the family for mass. The Church of San Vitale is covered in mosaics instead of frescoes or paintings. That is another thing that pops up as a trend during Christian Byzantine era art. They start producing mosaics. Unfortunately, one of the downsides with mosaics is that you cannot, with tiles, make things look three-dimensional or give depth. So we see a continuation of very flat two-dimensional depictions of objects and people. Some of the mosaics in the Church of San Vitale illustrate images of the emperor from when it was built, Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora. So there is a blend in the mosaic depictions between church and state, because they have biblical figures and religious imagery, as well as images of the emperor and his empress. And for those of you that are a bit more linear in thinking, Constantine will eventually die, and then Justinian will become emperor at a certain point. The Roman Empire falls a little while after Justinian is no longer an emperor of Rome. So here is the exterior of that Church of San Vitale. You can see it is not your normal octagon shape. It does have little side naves, once again to hold relics. Here is an example of one of the mosaics. This is a mosaic depiction of the Empress Theodora. So like I said, very flat. You still have the very large eyes, which are common in Christian art. She is decked out in very expensive clothing. And you'll notice there is a halo behind her. Any guesses as to why they would depict the Empress as well as the Emperor with a halo behind them?
Can you repeat that?
Hang on. Yeah, kind of like that. Sorry, when you were asking me to repeat it, Anna was answering. So the question I asked was why there's a halo behind the emperor and empress on these mosaics, and Anna kind of pretty much summed it up. It's basically them stating that the emperor and empress were chosen by God, and therefore they are religious figures themselves, even though they technically aren't in the Bible. Usually in art history, the only people that get halos are saints and religious figures from the Bible. Here's another image of the mosaics from San Vitale. Here we see Christ being depicted as the Panto creator, or the creator of all, surrounded by angels, as well as the emperor and empress once again. And that takes us over to the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Like I mentioned, the eastern half of the Roman Empire decided that it was going to follow Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Eastern Orthodox Christianity differs on several levels from Roman Catholicism, but one of the most basic things that differs between it is the idea of iconoclast or iconoclastic ideology. So an iconoclast is someone who strongly believes that you should not depict images of people in your artworks or religious figures. They feel that if you are depicting religious imagery in an artwork, you are not worshiping that religious figure, but you are worshiping the art piece. So it is a form of idolatry. So a great example there, it says punishment of those who owned images of Christ, Mary, saints, and angels. If you are found in possession of imagery or statues of religious figures, you were sinning, at least according to their ideas. Therefore, you would be punished for your sins. They wanted you to solely focus on prayers without needing some sort of an imagery to focus on, because you would end up praying to that image instead of the actual person. We do see a couple of examples of imagery that survived from the iconoclastic era of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. A majority of it, when it was confiscated, was destroyed, so there's not too many examples of Christian art from the Eastern Orthodox half. And then that last bit, it should have been on the previous slide. I need to fix that. Here's one image, once again, of Christ as Panto creator. This one is, well, it used to be in a cathedral in Sicily. It was unfortunately destroyed later on, but this once again just shows Christ as Panto creator in a mosaic form. That's not part of the Eastern Empire. Like I said, I need to fix the arrangement there. Sorry about that. But for the Eastern Orthodox style, it was very closely supervised by the church. And like I said, we don't have too many examples of human imagery from Eastern Orthodox, but one example that did survive is Andrei Rubelov's Old Testament Trinity. And once again, we don't have a very realistic depiction of humans, even from the Eastern Orthodox side of the Roman Empire with Christian art. The figures have very elongated, flat bodies, but he did use very bright, eye-catching colors for this very small painting. Here is that Old Testament Trinity there. You see three angels with, once again, like I said, very elongated. We call this an S shape, which is a bit sensual, form to their bodies, very flat, but bright, eye-catching colors were used. And that takes us to what exactly was happening up in Northern Europe. So like I said, eventually the Roman Empire, at least the western half, is going to end up being conquered by Germanic tribes that the Romans called barbarians. The barbarians had, like I said, no written language. They were nomadic. They moved around. They didn't have like a specific or anything, which to most people means that they are not civilized, or at least that's what ancient Romans believed. But they did possess very advanced metalworking skills, and we see those skills being used in the objects that still remains today, such as the Sutton Hoo purse cover that we're about to look at. Here is that purse cover. So this was found in the remains of a burial ship. We're talking about people that were basically like the Vikings, if you're familiar with their history. When someone died or someone really important died, they would place them on a burial ship with important possessions and set the ship on fire and set it out to sea. The Sutton Hoo burial ship was one that didn't entirely burn, and we found a good majority of everything that was left on it. Which is neat. We even still have basically the frame of the ship. It really didn't burn. And that's in a museum now in Great Britain. But here is the purse cover that was found. They also found a lot of coins, belt clasps, and all of them really showcase the craftsmanship and metalworking skills of this early people group. So you can see that there are animal-like creatures here, a lot of knots, which will be used for quite a long period of time in Celtic art. You see those definitely in Celtic crosses. And this is gold with enamel inlays. A lot of this northern Germanic tribes art has animal motifs, lots of uses of gold and repousse and inlays. Repousse is where you get a sheet of metal and from the back side you beat into it the images that you're wanting. So for that you do use like a softer metal like gold. But a lot of that. We also see tapestries from this area. And later on, when they do adopt a language, we see very decorative books come out. So eventually those Germanic tribes will end up adopting Christianity thanks to the spread of the languages and traditions from the Roman Empire to them. When they conquer Rome, they end up adopting quite a few of their customs and beliefs. And with that comes a writing system and a language. But in this Northern European art, they do something called illustrated manuscripts. So basically a picture book with a little bit of writing and a lot of pictures. The Book of Kells is, well, it is the most prominent book to come out, or illustrated manuscript to come out of the medieval era, especially from Northern Europe. It is located in Ireland in a really famous library there. And it's a large book. And every day the library will turn to a different page because it's in a glass case. You can't like touch it. It's a really, really old book and fall apart. So every day they'll turn a page so you can see a different illustration and different writings. Here is one, well, the probably most well-known page, the XP page from the Book of Kells. Get it? XP. You'll notice at the end of the P there is a human head. They did use a lot of random animal and human placements in the illustrations of the Book of Kells. If you ever really look at this page, you'll also find a cat and a mouse chasing each other on it, which is kind of cute, but a lot of ornate inlays on here as well that we just saw being echoed in that purse cover. Of course, a lot more ornate here than it was on the purse cover. And that takes us to Romanesque. So the Romanesque period is something that occurs in architecture and only architecture. Romanesque means that they were trying to use a Roman-like architectural format when they were making buildings and churches, specifically basilicas. So they start adding things like columns, arches, those architectural features that were first developed by the Greeks and Romans in their buildings. This is also the period of time in which feudalism is adopted by quite a majority of governments. And people begin to go on religious pilgrimages. I mentioned that idea of a pilgrimage earlier. A pilgrimage is a trip in which you visit all of the really famous churches to pray and see the relics. So it's like a big tourism thing. And supposedly if you went on this pilgrimage, you would be in a better spot with your faith. So early Roman Catholic Church, which is the church that we're talking about right now and the church that we're going to be talking about for a while, I will be referring to it as the church from now on because Roman Catholicism was the main, well, pretty much the only religion in Europe at that time. It's quite a bit different from Roman Catholic today. We're talking about really, really old school Roman Catholic that really doesn't exist anymore. Early Roman Catholicism relied on the idea that when you died, you would go into a state of purgatory, which is an in-between place. You weren't in heaven and you weren't in hell, and you needed to figure out a way to get out of purgatory. Today, you can get out of that state of purgatory by like praying and being a good Catholic person. Back then, if you wanted to get out of purgatory, you had to have enough money and donate enough money to the church to pray and show your faith with monetary value to get out of that state. Of course, that's entirely different today, which is probably a really good thing because we'd all be stuck in purgatory forever unless we were billionaires. But back then, pretty much only the wealthy people were guaranteed a spot in heaven. Of course, they had to donate a large chunk of money to the church. poorer people had to go do other things like these pilgrimages to ensure a good spot, not in purgatory, not in the in-between place, for their afterlife. So large groups of Christians would go on these pilgrimages, and because of that, they needed to build larger churches to house all of these tourists. So the architecture is very solid and sturdy and thick. We see a lot of concrete and marble, but the churches are a lot bigger than they were prior. They become massive fortress-like buildings. They'll have small windows, round arches, vaulted ceilings, and stone carvings of religious figures adorning them. We can see an example of those religious figures at the Church of the Christ of the Pentecost. And it's at this point in time, I know it seems like it hasn't been a long time in history, but it's been a few hundred years since any artist, architect, or sculptor has attempted to make large sculptures of humans since the Greeks and Romans. But it's during the Romanesque era that we finally see being used again, large sculptures of human figures. Are they realistic? No. But they are our earlier examples of, we're getting back there. Christian Byzantine art lasts for several hundred years. And then when Rome falls to the barbarians, we enter into something called the Dark Ages, which lasts for an extremely long period of time in European history. In the Romanesque era, we are still in those Dark Ages. The Dark Ages are known as a period of, well, not darkness, but people have lost all of the ideas that Greeks and Romans have taught us when the barbarians take over. So seeing some of those ideas pop up again in Romanesque architecture is very important for art history. Art history is very sad during the Dark Ages. Not much is made, which is why we didn't really talk about it too much because there's not much going on. So here is an image of those monumental carvings from the Romanesque era. Like I said, these are some of the first large carvings that we've seen since the BCE era, and now we're into 1125. So it's been a long time. And after the Romanesque era of architecture, we see the Gothic era of architecture pop up. Basically, what happens is the Romanesque ends up evolving into Gothic. The architects start trying to push that Roman style of architecture a little bit further and make it their own unique form. So we still see arches, but the arches have become pointed. We still see columns, but they're a lot thinner and skinnier. Churches have become even taller during the Gothic era and pointed and trying to reach upwards towards heaven. We also see, once again, like I said in the architectural section, the use of stained glass windows to try and bring heaven's light into the churches, the invention of flying buttresses to allow for all of those windows. And once again, a continuation of using a lot of statues and carvings to decorate the interior and exterior of the Gothic churches. So once again, these churches that were built in the Romanesque and Gothic era are massive. That's to house all of those tourists. The Romanesque era churches are just as big as this. But the interesting thing about Romanesque and Gothic churches is they still have that central basilica plan. So they're still based on the idea of a rectangle. But what happens during the Gothic era in particular is they add another rectangle going the opposite direction to make a cross. So they literally make a building in the shape of a cross. Romanesque era, they stick with that rectangular basilica, they just make it bigger. And we've talked about Chartres Cathedral quite a bit already. There's another view of that with the rose window and the transept windows below, as well as the 3 pointed arches and the 2 towers. Okay, so as you can see, Gothic architecture is extremely flamboyant. The later on in the Gothic period we go, the more ornate it becomes, which you just saw in these 2 towers. This one's from the beginning, this one's from the end of the Gothic era, and it's a lot more detailed than the early Gothic. So as Gothic goes along and progresses, it just becomes more, just more in general. And once again, you can see that stained glass window. That particular stained glass window is named the Rose de France. Of course, it's called a rose window, but that one is called the Rose de France window. We also see walkways leading up to the church and impressive statues, such as the one that we're about to look at. Gothic architectural styles will continue on into the early Renaissance period. But once again, like I said, they'll just become even more ornate as time goes on. And of course, the statues, as time goes on into the Renaissance period, will become a lot more realistic. Early Gothic statues, however, oh, here's that little window. In the center is Christ, and then stories from Christ's crucifixion around. And like I was saying, early Gothic statues are not too entirely realistic looking, but they are a little bit more detailed than the Romanesque style of statues. These are actually called door jambs, this particular statue. It's located on either side of these doors. There's statues on each side, and those statues are called door jambs. Just as a funny little name in art history that I've always thought was kind of interesting. So after the Gothic era of architecture, like I said, eventually we will morph into something called the Baroque era. Gothic architecture will continue on through the Renaissance period. But during the Renaissance period, other art styles besides architecture, like painting and sculpting, change quite a bit. And that takes us to our next section. But before I go into the next section, I do want to ask you guys your opinions on particularly the medieval art, Christian art, Gothic, and Romanesque architecture that we've talked about so far. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of seconds, maybe pick one of those things to think about and formulate an opinion in your head, or you can write it on paper, I don't care. And then I'll ask you guys your opinions on that in a second. So out of the periods that we just talked about, Christian, Byzantine, your medieval, Romanesque, and Gothic, pick one of those and formulate an opinion that's your own. It doesn't have to be a good one. Good or bad opinion. give you about 30 more seconds to come up with your thoughts. Grace, I don't hear from you that often, but I do enjoy reading your writings. So I am going to ask you, what did you choose and what are your thoughts on it? No, Grace? Someone online, anyone online. What did you choose and what are your thoughts?
I chose the early Christian art,
Uh-huh.
and I just thought I was more focusing on the mosaics that they had, and how, like, I don't know, I just really like those. Just seeing those throughout Europe and stuff, I really like that.
Yeah, there's only 2 times in our textbook that really we ever get to talk about mosaic art. One of them is with Christian Byzantine art, and the other one is with Islamic art. Christian Byzantine likes to portray Bible stories. Islamic art does a lot more floral designs and geometric designs, so they're quite a bit different. That's a good thing to mention. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I did early Christian art as well, and I was honestly going to talk about the mosaics too, but I thought it was interesting how they also, will make sense how they covered up the people in most of their, or all their paintings, but at the time most of the people in the same area weren't using clothing in their paintings.
Yeah, so prior to Christian, a lot of the artworks were nude, and then all of a sudden Christianity comes along and everything's censored. We'll see a shift back to nudity during the Renaissance era, in which Renaissance artists even show biblical figures in the buff. So that's kind of an interesting point to make. Thank you, Jarek. Anyone in class?
Of course, all of the art has been especially on such a big scale. And I really like how, from the beginning to the end of the period of Gothic period, it gradually gets more elaborate. And I like the feeling, or I like the idea of the Gothic clothing in general, just because on the outside it looks really visual and intimidating, and when you get on the inside, it's so, I think the arch is what makes it kind of expansive. It makes it feel like it's way bigger on the inside. The tall ceilings and big arches. And that goes.
Yeah. So for those online that are having problems hearing, because she's pretty far away, but that's fine. Magali was telling us why she loves Gothic architecture due to the large size and how it changes over time. And I totally agree. It's one of the few examples of architecture that we really truly see a progression as it goes forward. A lot of other architectural trends that we're going to talk about in this class, once they start it, they just keep doing the same thing going forward. It doesn't really mature at all. So I'm with you. I appreciate Gothic architecture probably quite a bit more than other architectural things that we talk about in this class. Okay, now we're going to move on to our next chapter, which is Renaissance art. So in this section, we're going to be going over the Renaissance era, the Baroque era, and the Rococo. We won't get to Baroque or Rococo until tomorrow. The Renaissance era itself is marked usually with the beginning inventions of the printing press. The printing press allows for the printing and publication of multiple books that are distributed widely to people in their own languages. So for the first time ever, people are able to read things like the Bible in English. Previously, the Bible was only available in Latin, and most people couldn't read Latin. It was already a dead language at that point in history. So we are talking about the 1400s right now. That's the time period we are in. With the spread of all of these books comes a bit of it, I would say an individualized, independent thinking is birthed from those materials that are released to the public. So things that we see happening during the Renaissance period are a birth of multiple Christian religions. So you see the religions of Calvinism, Baptist, Methodist, Jehovah's Witness, all of those different kinds of Christianity pop up during this era because people are reading the Bible for themselves and everyone is interpreting it differently. So the Catholic Church is beginning to lose parishioners because they're going to these new religions. So that in turn threatens the church's power and stronghold, which we will see them trying to counter that threat throughout art and using art. We also see a spread of scientific thoughts, thoughts that were formed by the early Greek and Roman scholars and philosophers, and they are being reborn again in this 1400s time frame. And artists, scientists, and well, pretty much everyone is starting to read all of these Greek and Roman studies and apply them to their daily lives. So basically, the Renaissance literally means a rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas. Also, it's partially due to humanism. Humanism is the idea that you need to be an individual person and not just follow what people tell you to do. The Baroque period is a period of art that follows the Renaissance period. Think Renaissance, but on steroids. Things get really ornate and exaggerated with the Baroque period. My art history professor, I know when I was an undergrad, hated the Baroque period, and I still to this day don't know why. I actually enjoy Baroque, but I consider it like a theatrical interpretation of the Renaissance. So very over the top, like a stage play with special spotlights and everything, which will make sense when we get to it. And then the Rococo period, I speak poorly of the Rococo period, but it's actually one of my favorites, like literal all-time favorites. But it represents something really bad, but it's really pretty to look at. So the Rococo period pops up in France. It only occurs in France. It's marked by a lot of pastels and romantic themes. So lovers is the main theme of Rococo period. It pops up in France during the time period in which Marie Antoinette is the queen and people are starving to death, and they're making an art about love. Which is a bit of a jarring juxtaposition to reality in France at that time period. But like I said, Baroque and Rococo we won't get to until tomorrow. So, like I said, Renaissance literally means rebirth. We're talking about a rebirth of those Greek and Roman ideas, and it's brought about thanks to the humanists and their humanism thinking style, which is the idea that humans should think for themselves and not just follow along what people tell them to do, and not be mindless sheep. Which is why we see so many ideas, inventions, and new religions pop up during this time period. This is also the time period of exploration. This is around when the New World is discovered. Like I mentioned, we're in the 1400s. So you can kind of figure out what's going to happen eventually. Because there is that renewed interest in Greek and Roman ideas, that spills over into art styles. So we're going to see art that's made in a very, very similar method into which the Greeks and the Romans made their art. In fact, some of the statues you won't be able to tell if it's ancient or Renaissance because they're done that similarly. In fact, I used to do an icebreaker little Kahoot thing on the very first day of class. And one of the images in that icebreaker activity was the statue of David by Michelangelo. And the question was, is this from ancient Greece? And almost half the people always chose ancient Greece because it's done in that style, but it's actually from the Renaissance. I'm glad some of you guys said that you really liked Christian art. It means I'm doing my job because I don't. I try very hard not to influence what you guys think as best as possible, but sometimes it does spill over. And I do that because I had a professor, like I said, that hated Rococo. She hated Baroque. And she hated this one particular male artist, pretty much just because he was a man. So I try very hard not to do that to you guys because, I don't know, I want you to have your own opinion, like the humanists. So we see a recovery of ancient texts from Muslim scholars, and they are being translated into languages that people are actually speaking in Europe, like I mentioned earlier. We also see the beginnings of people starting to sign their art and claim it as their own. The signing of artworks is actually a relatively new thing to do. Most people would not claim particular things as their own because they didn't see the importance of that. So it's around this time that we start seeing that happen, which is why we have the beginnings of really famous artists pop up like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, because they're some of the first artists to actually claim their artworks. We also see a rebirth of realism in art, it's particularly in paintings, but also in sculptures and other things. In painting, the invention of linear and atmospheric perspective really helped elevate the realism of the two-dimensional plane and give it the appearance of three-dimensionality. But the first image we're going to talk about is from the early Renaissance, early Renaissance. Because it's from the early Renaissance, it is not going to be extraordinarily realistic. As we progress throughout the Renaissance period, it's going to get even more advanced as far as trying to depict things realistically. Early Renaissance, they were trying, but they couldn't quite figure out how to do it. They kept trying their hand at different techniques and ideas, and they were playing with those techniques. And it's really during the High Renaissance with artists like Da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo that we really see that realism solidify itself in painting. Of course, we are starting off in the Italian Renaissance. There is a Northern Renaissance and an Italian Renaissance happening at the same exact time. We're going to start off in Italy and then we'll make our way to the Northern Renaissance, which is mostly happening in places like Amsterdam, Norway. We're talking about those Northern European countries, very northern. But like I said, we're starting off in Italy with the early Renaissance. This is Giotto di Bondoni's Lamentation. This is a wall fresco from a place called the Scrivini Chapel. The Scrivini Chapel was built and paid for by the Scrivini family. Once again, this is the era in which you were trying to pay your way into heaven. So a good chunk of the Italian art that we're going to witness was paid for by patrons trying to get in good standing with the Catholic Church. So the Scrivini family paid for this whole chapel to be built, and the entire chapel is covered from floor to ceiling with frescoes. The ceiling frescoes just have angels and saints little head shots of them. But the walls are covered in stories from the New Testament, such as this one right here. This is the part in which Christ has been taken off of the cross. And of course, here you see Mary holding Christ. This is going to be a popular subject matter for the Renaissance, Mary holding Christ right after he's been taken off of the cross. And here you see everyone is either crying, mourning, or just in shock. Of course, it's a very exaggerated shock. Now here, what they've done what Giotto's done to try and add a bit of depth and dimension is he has used stacking by placing figures on top of other figures to make it appear like there is some sort of a depth to the painting. We haven't seen that in a very, very long time, not since the paintings of Pompeii, which once again are from the BCE era. Of course, that's partially it's because mosaics were popular during the Christian Byzantine era, and then for the rest of the time, we didn't really see any of that. But we don't see them shrinking as they're going back, and in the background, instead of having like a landscape, it looks like it's just a blue backdrop and angels flying in the air. So not like a realism depth, but he's trying to create the illusion of depth. Like I said, Giotto is an early Renaissance artist, as is Donatello. Eventually, though, linear perspective will be invented by an artist named Brunelleschi, which we learned about him when we went over linear perspective those many, many days ago. Linear perspective is using mathematical proportions and ratios to try and figure out how big and small things need to be in respect to their position on the picture plane to try and make them look realistic and three-dimensional. Brunelleschi invents that, and other artists pick up on it very quickly. Masaccio is another artist that makes use of early linear perspective. Masaccio is another early Renaissance artist. And we're going to look at his use of linear perspective in the Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity is a painting that was once again commissioned by a patron, and it was displayed at the church. And there's quite a bit going on in the Holy Trinity. Kind of interesting. Of course, Brunelleschi invents linear perspective and uses it for a landscape of an actual real building. Masaccio is using linear perspective on something that he's created in his mind. So it's a bit different in the sense that he has nothing to really go off of as far as a blueprint, whereas Brunelleschi is literally trying to copy something that he saw. But here is that Holy Trinity. So you see Christ, God, and the Spirit is represented here by a dove right in between them. Below is Mary and one of the saints. I always forget if it's like John, Paul, or Peter. I think this one's John. I'm pretty sure this one's John. You see coffers in the ceiling, which are a Greek and Roman, well, mostly Roman architectural feature, as well as a Roman arch and Greek columns. Because once again, we are in the Renaissance era. We are trying to use Greek and Roman things in our art. And then this couple down below are the patron and his wife. And then down below that is a skeleton, which we'll talk about that skeleton in a second. Or I guess not. I forgot. I'm using the wrong presentation. I realized that about halfway through the last section, So we're kind of winging it, but we're doing okay today. So your linear perspective for this one falls right about here, right in between, which is where it should. I mean, your main focal point for this painting is the Holy Trinity. So you would want all of those lines to converge around the Holy Trinity. And then right down here, we have that skeleton, which is probably the most interesting part, at least to me, of the painting. It's during the Renaissance period that we see the birth of memento mori paintings. Memento mori literally translates to remember death. So they're trying to remind you that you are going to die. That's the point. You will die eventually. So you need to get right with God before you do so. And that is the whole message of this painting. We see the Holy Trinity there representing the person that you need to get right with, as well as two holy figures. Here's the patron and his wife. This whole painting was commissioned and paid for so that they could get right with God before they die, because they know they're going to die. The whole point. Memento moris are most popular in the Northern Renaissance, and we're going to talk about them quite a bit there. But we do see some examples in Italian Renaissance, obviously, like this one. And there is a little script in Latin there that goes something along the lines, and this is the part that I was trying to go to the next slide because I can never remember the exact quote. It goes something along the lines of, I am, and therefore you also will be, something like that, to remind you that you're going to die. Very fancy, wordy quote for that. Which takes us to our first example of a sculpture from early Renaissance. Like I mentioned, Donatello is an early Renaissance sculpture. And we're going to look at his sculpture of the biblical figure David. We're actually going to be looking at 3 Davids for this section, 3 sculptures of David. This particular David is from the early Renaissance. The second David is from the High Renaissance, and the final David sculpture that we're going to look at is from the Baroque period. So we're going to see a progression of the same subject matter as time goes out or plays out in this era. Our first statue of David is nude. So we do see a return to nude subject matter. Once again, we're trying to copy Greek and Roman classical sculptures that are being found and displayed now. Why choose the statue of David? Well, David is the patron saint, basically, of Florence. Florence was a very small Italian city-state, and it was surrounded by very powerful, wealthy, large city-states. So Florence felt like it was David surrounded by a bunch of Goliaths. So they chose to use David as a motif to represent their city. So every single David statue we're going to be looking at was made for the city of Florence. This is the first life-size freestanding nude statue since ancient Roman times. We see, instead of a god or goddess, though, a biblical figure. And we are going to be talking about it because it's kind of interesting. This was commissioned by the Medici family. The Medici family ends up having several popes, marrying a lot of kings and queens. They're very powerful, very wealthy. Here is that statue of David. First off, what I'm going to ask someone online, what is the medium? Somebody online, what's the medium? Medium is what it's made of.
Is it bronze?
Yes, it's bronze. So this is bronze, and I'm pointing that out because we're going to have different mediums with the different Davids. So a lot of early Renaissance sculptures are made in bronze. Later on, they will start using marble, which is more similar to what Romans used. The Greeks used, of course, bronze, but they didn't know that, and we'll talk about that later on. So what do we think of this David? Describe him, anyone, in class or online. Yeah, so Anna said he looks scrawny, which is yes, he does look scrawny. So would you say he's younger than what a normal idealized Greek or Roman sculpture would be? Yeah, so normal Greek and Roman sculptures would show people in their 20s. This David is obviously a bit younger than that, so that's why he looks a little scrawny. It's also why there's something else going on. Does this David look manly or masculine?
No, I was gonna say he looked feminine.
Yes, he looks feminine, once again, because he's younger. So he is quite a bit feminine, especially in comparison to the other Davids that we're going to end up looking at. Now, the last big question is, what step are we in? So those of you that might not be familiar, the story of David is David and Goliath. David slays the giant Goliath and saves the Jewish people from being conquered. Now, are we in the process of killing Goliath, getting ready to kill Goliath, or have we already killed Goliath? We have already killed Goliath. So those of you that are really familiar with your Bible story, you know that at the end he grabs a sword and cuts off Goliath's head. And right here he is standing on Goliath's head. Of course, we do see a rebirth of contrapposto poses. We didn't see that in any of the other sculptures that we talked about for Romanesque or Gothic era. So we see a reusage of that counterpoise contrapposto stance. And that will continue on throughout the Renaissance era. And of course, Donatello's David, like we mentioned, he is a bit feminine, so he did end up becoming a symbol of beauty. In juxtaposition, however, Mary Magdalene, which is another statue by David, is quite a bit haggard. And here she is here. So Donatello did not always make beautiful things. He could also make things look very haggard and withered away. And this one is made of wood and it's partially gilded in gold. Next, we're going to look at Botticelli's Birth of Venus. So this is a painting done in tempera, which is that egg wash painting style. It's one of the first examples of Neoplatonism. Well, it is the example of Neoplatonism that we're going to be looking at. Neoplatonism was the belief that people should reject the religious imagery and start painting things outside of religion. For a very long time in art, we only see examples of biblical figures. In fact, since Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, we only see examples of Christianity in art. Neoplatonism is a rebirth of using the mythological figures from ancient Greece and Rome, those pagan figures, in images. So it's very secular. It was not done for the church. It was done by individual people that were wanting artworks for their homes. And Birth of Venus, of course, showcases the goddess Venus. She is trying to be in a modest pose. If you remember our Venus de Medici statue that we talked about yesterday, it's a very similar pose to that. And of course, the birth of Venus is an actual mythological story of the birth of Venus. She was born of sea foam. And here is that very famous painting. So she was born and she's trying to cover herself with her hair and her hands. One of the floral goddesses is coming to bring her something to cover herself with, and Nimbus and his lover are working on blowing her to shore. And that takes us to the High Renaissance, which is actually where we're going to stop today. So tomorrow we're going to pick up with the High Renaissance, then go towards the Northern Renaissance, and finish off with Baroque and Rococo. And tomorrow, keep in mind, I'm going to be asking you guys a question similar to what I did today, in which I will have you pick a period between early Renaissance, High Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo and discuss it. So if you're wanting to do early, you might want to put an asterisk next to those thoughts, or you can wait until we talk about High, Baroque, or Rococo. Also, keep in mind that you guys need to not only continue working on your gallery report, but you also have that discussion post. The discussion post asks you to discuss the 3 periods of Greek art that we talked about yesterday, the Archaic period, Classical period, and Hellenistic period. Discuss the characteristics and some of the artworks from those periods. You don't have to respond to anyone else's post, but you might want to go ahead and get that done before you forget too much of that section. Of course, I will see you all tomorrow to finish up the Renaissance section, and then next week we will get into non-Western art. But until then, have a wonderful day. Are you guys ready? Okay. Like, I don't know. A bunch of people still have their computers out.
And you guys can stay in here if you want to, I want that. Yeah, that looks good. That first option. Just don't forget to double check. Yeah, I always do that format then. It's just my real job. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be perfect. Yeah. Did I not spray yours? I thought you did. Okay. Which was my brother. Spray my brother.
Oh, sorry.